Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Katie Gilman, the Membership and Communications Coordinator at the Council. I'm excited to present today's program, Parliamentary America, A New Vision for Democracy. We're joined by Max Stearns, author of Parliamentary America, and Venable Betcher and Howard Professor of Law at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, and Emily Zackin, Associate Professor of Political Science at the Johns Hopkins School of Arts and Sciences. For those of you that would like to submit questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. Rachel Kenderdine and I will be managing your questions during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 40 minutes. I can't wait for this important conversation to begin, so Emily, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks. And thanks, Max, for being here and chatting with me about your exciting new book. And actually, I should confess to our audience that this isn't the first conversation we've had about the book. I've had a chance to talk to Max several times, and each time we talk about this book, Max, you say, you know, I felt compelled to write this. I know this isn't your first book, but I think this is the only one where you had this sensation that you looked around the world and had to write the book. And as soon as I started reading, I realized why, because the opening pages say we are in a constitutional crisis. And the book is addressed to that crisis. So I was hoping you could begin by explaining to us generally what is a constitutional crisis, and then specifically, why are we in one right now?
Well, first off, thank you for doing this event, and thank you, Emily, for indulging this project now more than once. It's always a pleasure to talk to you about these important questions. So what is a constitutional crisis, and how are we in one? This is the third constitutional crisis that our nation has faced. The first, of course, the period that resulted in ending the Articles of Confederation, ditching that in favor of more or less the Constitution that we have. And then in the period leading up, of course, to the Civil War and Reconstruction, which tragically ended earlier than it should have to effectuate the goals of the Reconstruction Amendment. So that was the second period of a constitutional crisis. And today we're in a constitutional crisis that's marked by two ever-widening political parties and two ever-widening cultural divides, where it's no longer the case that we believe that the other side looks at common information or sources with us and in good faith comes out to a different place. We now think that anybody who disagrees with us on the basic questions that as a society we're asking must lack basic intelligence or be evil. And what all of these periods have in common is that they all arose in a period where the structure of the Constitution under which we're operating fundamentally thwarted our capacity for effective governance and for effective social cohesion. And we are experiencing that full force. And so we are in the midst of a really profound constitutional crisis, as profound as the first two.
So now that you've set us up with this historical introduction to constitutional crisis, I think it's possible that readers might expect a book by a constitutional law professor to be filled with either constitutional history or case law, or both, a kind of walk through the way the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution. And yet, having now read the book very carefully, I can find very little of that in the book. And instead, there are these really interesting, really snappy descriptions, mostly of children's games. So there's rock, paper, we're told we have a rock, paper, scissors constitution. The book opens with a imagined birthday party. Children are choosing cupcake flavors or birthday cake flavors. And then a little later into the book, we get some really clear, helpful descriptions of mathematical theorems, and we get diagrams. Why is it that, having started out saying we're in our third constitutional crisis and we have a history of these sort of recurrent problems, does the book itself contain this different kind of analysis?
So the reason for that is that what I'm doing in this book is using some tools that are specifically designed to study institutions. I'm a bit of an unusual constitutional law professor because over the course of my career, I've spent a lot of time borrowing tools from game theory, a discipline called social choice theory. These are disciplines that really are designed to study how institutions work. And that's been a focal point of mine for decades. And when I began thinking about this project, when I began thinking about the fact that we are in a constitutional crisis, it also occurred to me that although more and more people were seeing that, they weren't offering proposals for reform that would solve the crisis, that could be enacted, or more typically both. And I had a set of tools that allowed me to see why that was the case, and also to see my way to a solution that would work, would pull us out of the crisis, could be enacted. And it was very important to me that this book, unlike others that I've written, be produced and written for a general audience of concerned citizens, people who are deeply concerned about what's happening to their democracy, to our democracy, and who are really looking for a way out. And so it was important to me to take my readers to the playground, to show them how things that are very familiar will allow them to gain a better understanding of what's happened here, and also how we could do democracy better.
Do you want to say a little bit more about the kind of institutional structures that you are helping your readers understand, and the structural problems you've diagnosed?
Yeah, so I'll start with the very beginning. I'll start with one that really is profound that you referred to, the rock, paper, scissors Constitution, which a little later in the book I referred to as the unicycle Constitution. The idea that the way the Constitution was supposed to work, the way Madison conceived it, the way the framers understood it, we were going to have a set of never-ending rivalries among the branches of government. Each branch could defeat or be defeated by another branch of government, like rock, paper, scissors. And in addition, we have an overlay where we have a rival game between the federal government and states. So we combine this notion of separation of powers and federalism. And through a combination of these never-ending rivalries, we would not experience what Madison described as the violence of factions. And you can think of that as precursors to political parties, but instead, because of the way the Constitution was set up, we inevitably over time tended toward geographically defined elections for the House of Representatives, for the Senate, but for the Electoral College, or even in spite of the Electoral College, ultimately for the presidency itself. And what happens in that game is each side realizes that the way to win when you've got a single person who's going to be elected from a geographically defined area, the way to win is to divide the opposition and keep your side intact. Both sides appreciate that same dynamic, and that produces a two-party system which we've lived with since the beginning of our nation's history. And in fact, go back to George Washington's farewell address. He talks about the fact that partisanship has kind of overtaken the understanding of these rival games that we associate with our early lessons that we get in middle school and high school about how the American constitutional system works, but actually doesn't. And what's important for people to understand is that although we endured this two-party system for a very long time, over a couple of hundred years, when we get to the information age, it really has become profoundly problematic and dysfunctional. It hasn't been perfect all along by any stretch, but it has become worse as a result of various innovations in the information age that have caused the parties to just grow further and further apart.
So how has the media environment contributed to this partisan polarization you're describing?
So it's a combination of two things really in the information age: the media environment, social media in particular. Today we have a lot of news about TikTok going on, which has its own complicated implications. But that, and in addition, hyperpartisan gerrymandering, and they're synergistic. So let me just start with hyperpartisan gerrymandering. There, in the aftermath of Obama's initial election, Republican operatives realized that for pennies on the dollar, they could throw money to below the radar state races and turn enough blue and purple states red. And since state general assemblies draw the House of Representatives districting maps, they could entrench a conservative majority in the House of Representatives. They thought for 30 years it was a little bit ambitious, but the consequence of what's called red mapping on the Republican side, blue mapping on the Democratic side, is that House elections are no longer competitive, which isn't quite true. They're not competitive in the general election, but they're competitive in the primary. But in the primary, it just emboldens each side, because if you're not feeding the base strongly enough, you'll be primaried by somebody who will. Social media, the business model through which we get so much of our news and news-like information, depends upon those who use social media remaining glued to the screen. And how do you do that? Well, you do that either by giving them affirming content that makes them feel like they're on the righteous side, they're on the good side of history and culture, or give them exactly the opposite. Give them content that allows them, with their friends, to denigrate the other side. And what we end up with this is this sort of tragic synergistic loop from media that's growing further apart to our citizenry growing further apart, to politicians growing further apart, feeding the media, and on it goes. And this is not an impressionistic thing. If you look at the Pew Research data from roughly the early to mid-90s to now, you see the two parties that once had considerable overlap really are growing further and further apart, to the point that we are almost two separate cultures who just fundamentally, whichever one we're in, distrusts the other.
So can I push on you a little bit here?
Absolutely.
I study political history, constitutional history, and I might want to argue that the two parties are getting farther and farther apart because Southern Democrats, who were the sort of segregationist wing of the Democratic Party, realigned, moved over, and became Republicans. And so only when we were counting those Southern Democrats as Democrats did the parties look sort of overlapping. Now that they've sorted themselves into parties at least partially distinguished by racial views, you might even say racial resentment, that's what's causing polarization. It's not the media environment or the two-party system. It's really this, the challenge of building a multiracial democracy.
So I would say that what you're conveying is part of the story, but not the dominant part of the story. And in fact, if we go back even further, if we go back to the 1950s, this is something that a lot of people would find shocking, that in the 1952 election, both the Democratic and Republican Party went after the same person to be the head of their ticket, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And the American Political Science Association wrote a major study in that same period of time, criticizing the two-party system. And what was the critique? They were insufficiently distinct and didn't give meaningful choice to the voters. And in that same period of time, in 1957, an economist by the name of Anthony Downs wrote a book called An Economic Theory of Democracy. And most people probably haven't heard of the book, but in their minds, they have the model on which the book rests, which is this notion that we can draw a single line left to right, have a really liberal candidate, we'll call it the Democrat to the left, conservative candidate, call it the Republican to the right. And the idea is that over time, they'll converge on the center, or what's known as the median voter. And in the period that Anthony Downs wrote that book, that wasn't a crazy idea. But if you look at the trend lines from the 50s until now, the modes are growing further and further apart. Part of that, absolutely, I agree with you, has to do with the fact that there's better sort of assortative mating of people who align with one party or the other. So Southern Democrats are now Republicans, Rockefeller Republicans are now Democrats. But there's absolutely no doubt, based on myriad studies of our polarization, that even if you set aside those sort of realignments, the centers of these two parties have grown dramatically far apart. So I don't think our stories are inconsistent. It's hard to untangle these things because, right, they're sort of confounding variables. But I do think the dominant story is that we are being fed information and candidates that we're not controlling. Media is choosing us, candidates are choosing us, and it is driving a wedge between these two parties that is, in fact, ever widening.
You know, just anecdotally, I taught this median voter theory for a long time. And when I first started teaching it, my students would nod along. They'd say, oh yeah, that makes sense. The last time I tried to teach it, students were like, this is nuts. Yes, what are you talking about, median voter? And I had to agree. Yes, it no longer seemed like a good description.
It's funny, when I teach it, I do point out the historical period in which it was written, and then the students get it. They say, oh, okay, there was a time. It's just not now. So.
I think that's really right. All right, so now we've got, I think, a clear picture of the problem. We have we're stuck with the two-party system, and that two-party system has collided with gerrymandering and our media environment to create a kind of hyperpolarization and kind of hostility. What's the solution?
So the solution, well, first we have to identify what the problem is. So that is sort of the diagnostic, but what does it give rise to that causes voters such anger and frustration? I call it the third party dilemma. So I want to be clear. We have a two-party system for the reasons I've described, right? Divide the opposition, keep your side intact. But in a two-party system, it doesn't mean we don't have third parties. When you go to vote, you see all kinds of parties listed. There are third, fourth, fifth to nth parties. A two-party system means that third parties play a confounding role. When you vote for them, you are punished. And what that means is that if you vote for a spoiler, somebody to the left of the Democratic Party, somebody to the right of the Republican nominee, you're throwing weight to the candidate that you least prefer of the two major candidates, the only candidates who have a shot at winning. Or alternatively, you might be voting for a third-party candidate that pulls in votes from both sides, and I call that a randomizer, somebody who threatens to make the election of the president, the most important office in the land and arguably the world, a crapshoot. And so what we have to do is solve the third-party dilemma. And what I suggest is that the way to do that is to create a meaningful role for third parties so that when you vote for third parties, you're not punished, but you are rewarded. And when those third parties do politics well, they deliver to their constituencies. And the way to do that is not to tell people to play better. It's not to just have third parties appear in a two-party system. It requires foundational structural change. And I'm advocating a change that embraces features of parliamentary democracy. The title of the book is Parliamentary America, the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy. And what I do is I take people around the world. I show them how democracies work in other systems: England, France, Germany, Israel, Taiwan, Brazil, and Venezuela. And I show them how we can integrate the best features as our own through a series of amendments. But that's what we have to do. We have to engage in structural reform, not ditching the Constitution. We can fix it without getting rid of it, that will allow us to create space for genuine third parties to emerge and thrive and to reward people who support those parties.
So let's walk through. You proposed 3 amendments, 3 big structural changes to the US Constitution. Let's walk through those very briefly. The first one, you're going to restructure the House of Representatives. Can you tell us how you want to do that?
So picture this: you go in to vote every 2 years for the House of Representatives, just like you do now, except here's the difference. Instead of casting one ballot, you're going to cast 2 ballots. So the first ballot is going to be just like you do now for a district election. So you're going to have candidates running for a districted seat for the reasons I've previously described. You're going to have 2 parties dominating in that race because the goal is to keep your side together, divide the opposition. So there'll be 2 primary parties operating in that race. But then you're going to have an opportunity to cast a second ballot. And that second ballot isn't going to be for a person, it's going to be for a party. And what's going to happen in my system is, and this relates to the second of the 2 amendments, there's going to be a really significant role that smaller parties play. And so let's say that you are a progressive Democrat. And so in your district election, you vote for the Democratic candidate, and in the party ballot, you vote for the Progressive Party. You're signaling that you want the Democratic Party to lead what becomes ultimately negotiations. We'll talk about that, but you want it to be in a progressive direction. Let's say that you're a moderate Republican or an anti-MAGA Republican. You would presumably vote for the GOP candidate, but you might vote when it comes to the party either for the GOP or maybe even the Democratic Party. See, these parties will fracture. The Democratic Party will split into the ordinary Democrats and the progressives, the Republican Party, will split into the regular GOP and maybe America First. There might be a Green Party. There might be a Libertarian Party. And you'll be able to send a really precise signal about the direction that you want that coalition to occur. And what will happen is we'll take the proportionality ballots, the second ballots. So we're doubling each state's coalition. If you had 10, you have 20 members of the House of Representatives. But we're going to take the proportional ballots, party-based ballots, proportionally state by state, and use that to ensure proportionality for each state's delegation to the House of Representatives. Different states have different size delegations, so we're not going to get perfect proportionality. But as a result of the first ballot, we're going to have two parties. They probably get more seats than others. As a result of the second ballot, the proportionality principle, no party will predictably get a majority. Each party is going to have to form a coalition with others to create a government. And that's vitally significant.
And after they've formed a government, you and I will no longer be able to vote for our president and vice president because of the Second Amendment you're proposing. Can you explain why that is, what that achieves?
Yes. So instead of voting for the president or vice president, you finally get to have a meaningful signal that you send as to what you want the government to do. So rather than taking power away from voters, this actually gives meaningful power to voters. Just think of this. Today, we have two candidates about to run for president, Joe Biden, Donald Trump. 63% of American voters wish that neither of them were running. One of them is facing 91 counts of criminal indictments and might be convicted before he's elected. The other one would be the oldest elected person to the presidency if reelected. And the vast majority of Americans wish that weren't the case. What I'm proposing is a system whereby, in descending order of representation in the House of Representatives, the leaders of up to 5 parties will negotiate a governing coalition with other parties until they achieve a majority coalition, at which point the leading parties' pre-designated slate for president and vice president assume those offices, and they do it on a fixed schedule. So unlike other parliamentary regimes, there'll be a backstop. We'll be able to do this on a fixed calendar. Lines of succession remain intact. Presidential terms at 4 years, 2 terms maximum, remain intact. Now think about this. When you vote for a third party, let's say that you are that progressive Democrat and you vote for the Progressive Party, okay? The Progressive Party will say to the Democrats, or perhaps the Republicans, I'm willing to join your coalition so that you can get to a majority. However, in order to do that, in order for us to do that, you have to give us something in return. You have to give us policy commitments that our constituents value. You have to give us some seats in your cabinet. Maybe even you have to give us the first Supreme Court seat that opens up. And suddenly, you are rewarded for voting for a third party rather than punished. And think of this. Rather than campaigns of denigration, which is what we have experienced for too many election cycles, where basically the campaign is the other side is evil and its supporters lack basic intelligence. In order to be an effective campaigner for a party, you're going to have to demonstrate a willingness and even a commitment to working well with others. You're going to have to be able to say, I may disagree with this other party. I may disagree strongly about certain policy commitments, but I agree on this. I agree on the project of effective democratic governance, and we can come together around issues and values we share in common to further the interests of American people. Just imagine how much that kind of campaign will make you feel better as a voter than the campaigns that we have today. So yeah, you don't get to vote directly for president. That's because you're going to be far more powerful and influential when you cast the ballots in this system.
And how about removing a president? Because your third proposed amendment is I believe you leave the impeachment procedure we have now in place, but you add another procedure for removing a president. Can you tell us more about why you do that and what the procedure is?
So imagine that we went back in time. We went to the Philadelphia Convention that was drafting the Constitution. We just knocked on the door, went in the room, and we said, here's a question for you folks. If this system works, let's say, for a quarter of a millennium, do you think that the American voters will never elect a president who warrants removal under this impeachment clause that you all are debating? I think they'd laugh at us, rightly so. Of course not, right? No system of government's perfect and no electorate ever gets it right every single time. And yet here we are, right? We have never had a president successfully removed through the impeachment clause. So in order to actually implement a system of greater accountability, we have to have a meaningful way to hold the person who holds the highest office in the land accountable. But we don't want to make it so easy that a simple disagreement on policy becomes a basis for removal. So I've got a high bar, but not as high as the impeachment bar. A supermajority of 60% of the House can vote to remove a president based on a vote of no confidence for maladministration. Now, if you think about it, if the majority coalition has 50 to 55% say of the seats, 60% means that you're going to have to bring on board some people that were part of that original coalition. It's going to have to be serious to vote someone out based on maladministration. And in the book, I'm very clear about this. I do not give maladministration some technical legal definition so that it can be gained. I think that we have to learn from experience. What I do in the book is go through a series of examples over the past several presidencies of behaviors, and I explain why some might regard this a basis for maladministration or not. Because ultimately, I think it's very hard to anticipate specific circumstances that will occur, and we have to assume that by the lights of future generations that will operate in this system, they will learn from their experience better than we can predict what they might learn from their experience. But I think it's important, finally, to have a means of removing a fundamentally incapable or unwilling person, unwilling to actually further the objectives of our democracy, and frankly, incapable of the level of mastery required for that most significant office in this country and arguably in the world.
That makes sense to me. So now in recommending a Parliamentary America, you take us through other parliamentary systems. You have 2 chapters of the book devoted to, I think you referred to it here today too, as a world tour. And I think in the interest of time, I won't ask you to take us on this world tour, but I do want to address what I think may be a kind of common concern among some of your listeners or readers, which is that America is different. We have a distinctive constitutional tradition and history, and things like voting for a president are so ingrained in our constitutional culture and our democratic life that it's not really possible or appropriate to look to another system and say, aha, we'll just adopt that here. How do you think about this comparative lens, and why do you feel like it's okay, it's helpful to take other countries' systems and implement them here?
I'll even go beyond helpful. I think it's vital. So what I would say is that what you're describing is the problem that we've all grown up since middle school and high school, those of us that were raised in the United States, with this story about American exceptionalism. And the story goes like this. Our Constitution has endured longer than that of any other nation in the world. But ask yourself this question. If you're evaluating systems, whether it's engineering systems, business models, other technologies, musical genres, or artistic, various forms, would you say that a single isolated example that has persisted on its own is the way to figure out wisdom and soundness? Or would you say that something that's been replicated and adapted successfully to different cultures, different needs, again and again and again, exhibits wisdom and soundness? I would suggest that the vast majority of people understand that the test of wisdom and soundness is replication, not isolated endurance. And although we have exported democracy across the globe, we have never successfully exported our system of two-party presidentialism. We are an outlier. We are a recluse on the world stage. And so we have to get past American exceptionalism to understand that we can learn from the experiences of millions of people around the globe who have faced down on their own the threat against democracy, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And one of the key lessons from the world tour is that the real threat to democracy is extremism, whether we're talking about extremism on ideology or extremism with respect to parties. Too few parties like the US and the UK, think of Brexit, or too many parties. Look at Brazil's hyper-fragmented parties. Look at what's happened in Italy. Look at what's happened in Israel. What we need to recognize is what other countries have recognized, which is the need for a system that gives voters more choices, more parties than two, but not so many more choices, that the same threat that pervades a two-party system pervades a hyper-fragmented system. And the threat is that when you have a two-party system, you cannot afford to give up any of your constituents, because if you do, you throw weight to the other side. Somebody like a Donald Trump can come in and take over a party and then take over the government. And in a hyper-fractionalized system, a high-valence politician, an ideologue can come in and get more seats than any other party, but still be an outlier and begin rolling over the other parties one by one. The twin threats to democracy are too few parties or too many. And we have to hit that sweet spot, that Goldilocks principle. And that's the central lesson of the World Tour. We have to learn from the experience of other nations that there's a better way to do democracy despite what we were fed as children.
All right. I'm with you. I hope we can convince Americans that the things we learned as children need to be overcome, that we have to be clear-eyed about our system. But I still have some concerns about plausibility. Do you really think we can pass 3, what you even describe in the subtitle as radical changes to the US Constitution? And let me kind of back up a minute and motivate that question by saying that it's empirically very challenging to amend the US Constitution. So even extremely popular amendments or proposals have failed to meet the threshold set out in Article 5. Can you talk us through kind of how you envision Americans actually coming together? Even if we believe you, this would be better. How do we get from here to there, from believing you to really actually amending the Constitution?
So this is really important for Americans to understand. There are a boatload of proposals out there about how to fix our democracy: ranked choice voting, term limits, multi-member districts, abolish the Electoral College. Okay. Let's set aside the Electoral College, because we're talking about the legislature here. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But these other 3 proposals that are getting lots of traction and conversation. Number 1, they won't solve the constitutional crisis because they won't end two-party presidentialism. But more importantly, they translate into unemployment acts for sitting members of Congress. The whole purpose of ranked choice voting, multi-member districts, and term limits is to replace sitting members of Congress with others who people hope will be more moderate. We've never had a constitutional convention under the Constitution. We've come close twice, within one state or 2 states in the 60s and 80s. It requires 2/3 of the states to call a constitutional convention, or Congress, by a 2/3 vote in each house, can propose an amendment, and these amendments have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. The mistake is to imagine that the thing to be avoided is amending because of the high bar. The thing to be avoided is a proposal that won't solve the problem and that can't be enacted because the key officials required to enact them are going to oppose it, because nobody's going to vote for their own unemployment. And we're going to hit an inflection point. I don't know when. It might be soon. Depending on what happens in 2024, we could really be at the precipice. It could be in several years. It could be after I am no longer here. But we will inevitably hit an inflection point. We are watching the equivalent of 2 colliding trains. We are in a constitutional crisis. And when we hit that inflection point, what is vital is that Americans understand, number 1, what the root cause of the problem is. Number 2, what is required to fix it. In the subtitle of the book, Least Radical Means of Radically Repairing Our Broken Democracy, what I propose is radical, but it keeps vital American institutions, and unlike virtually every other proposal that's out there, it achieves the buy-in of the key political actors who can block other reforms, and who, by enacting these reforms, let's say we have a constitutional convention that proposes those other things, they can suddenly have a pressure release valve whereby they get to solve the crisis, keep their jobs, because they get to keep their existing seats, right? Unlike every other proposal. And they get to claim to be the heroes of democracy. And you and I may not like these people, and that's fine. We don't have to like them. We just need them to do the job of creating a highly functional democracy that they can leave as their legacy and we can claim as ours. This proposal uniquely allows that to happen.
So it's interesting because it's a proposal to reform what is arguably our most democratic representative branch of government. And yet these three amendments don't touch what are arguably the least majoritarian branches of our government, the Senate and or organs of our government, the Senate and the Supreme Court. Could you talk a little bit about, that's a little counterintuitive because many people think fix our democracy, well, we got to get rid of the least democratic parts. And yet you have this other approach. Can you talk about why you leave the Senate and the Supreme Court alone, at least in these amendments, and instead target the House of Representatives?
The reason is that what I'm claiming is we need to understand the pathology that gives rise to the crisis that we face. And the pathology is a two-party presidential system with the parties growing ever further apart. I am not a fan of the Senate. I'm not much of a fan of the Supreme Court, despite the fact that my bread and butter is teaching constitutional law. I spend a lot of time teaching Supreme Court cases. However, we can work with the Senate. My goal is not to give a grab bag of things that will make people happy. My goal is to give the minimal solutions that allow us to become a thriving multi-party democracy, because once we're that, we can take on these other things. The Senate is the most anti-democratic institution of any nation in the world that claims to be a democracy. If you are a Wyoming voter, your vote equals that of 67 California voters. If you take the total population of the lowest population 21 states, which together get 42% of the Senate, their populations equal roughly that of California, which with 2 senators gets 2% of the Senate. It is an egregiously anti-democratic institution. But here's the thing. Once we become a multi-party democracy, although it's true that in the Senate races, you're going to see 2 parties dominating for the reasons that I won't repeat, but that I've previously described, it doesn't mean that we'll have the same 2 parties in every region of the country. 2 parties can be different in various parts of the country. There's precedent for this. We once had the Farmers Party dominating in Minnesota and other parts of that region of the country. As a consequence, over time in this system, the Senate will become a multi-party institution. And when that occurs, we can take on the Senate. We can think of ways of making it better. And I've got proposals to do that in chapter 11 of my book, which is what the world's going to look like in parliamentary America. When we are in parliamentary America, we can take that on. And I also talk about the Supreme Court there. There are things we can do. Think of the egregious unfairness of the fact that Donald Trump appointed 3 justices, 2 of whom were separated in their deaths by 4 years and 7 months. Now, it may not be the best rule in the world to say that you get to appoint justices that happen to retire or die in the precise 4-year window when you are president. Not necessarily the best rule, but you could have another rule. Like you could say, okay, let's make it so that the last year of the Obama administration, that one we throw to the electorate. So the next president gets that. But if you're going to do that, then it should be you get 1 year before you start till the year before you end, and you still get 4 years. It's a different 4 years. Now, that's sort of a stupid rule, but it's not an unfair rule. It's just a stupid rule. You could make it 2 + 2, just so long as it's 4. But nobody would accept that Trump gets 5 for his 4-year term, and the second Obama term, he only gets 3. Nobody would say that. That is a fundamental erosion of a long-standing democratic norm. And there's a great book by Ziblatt and Levitsky called How Democracies Die. And the central lesson is that although people think that democracies die in a spectacular military fashion, that's not always the case. More often it is through the gradual erosion of democratic norms. And we're experiencing that full force. So what I want to do is find the root cause of that erosion, target it for a precise cure in a surgical way. So although it's radical, it's least radical, and then say, we might not properly anticipate other problems that are going to arise, but we can leave it to people operating under a truly democratic system to tackle them. Here are some ideas I have of other things that we could do: Senate, Supreme Court, but fixing that won't fix our democracy. We can leave that till later.
So I think we're almost time to turn it over to the audience for questions. But before we do, I want to say I'm struck in reading your book by its genuinely optimistic tone. And we spent a lot of this discussion, I think, because of my questions, emphasizing the crisis and the impending death of our democracy. I wanted to give you a chance to end on the kind of optimistic note in your book. If we can make these changes, how do you anticipate the world, American democracy functioning? Do you want to paint us the picture of what it'll look like if we manage to make these changes?
I'm very happy to. And I want to say that I'm not Pollyannish. I think anybody who knows me will say that I'm not naive. I'm not. But I think that we have two jobs as Americans. Number one, we actually have to be educated. We have to learn. We have to be willing to challenge things that we've thought were true because we learned them as children. There are lots of things we learned as children that actually, on proper investigation and interrogation, turn out not to be true. And we have to be willing to learn from the experience of others around the world that have successfully or unsuccessfully faced threats to their democracy so that we can benefit from their experience. So the first thing that we have an obligation to do is to educate ourselves. But the second thing we have an obligation to do is to be optimistic. The project of American democracy is fundamentally important, not just to us, to our children and future generations, but frankly, to the world. We can't give up on it. It is too important a project. And the vision that I have is, once we become a thriving, functional democracy, we're not going to sit around singing Kumbaya. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of harm that has happened over the last several decades. But we can work together to tackle it. We can become a polity. Again, I really believe we can. But we need institutions to allow that to happen. And that requires fundamental reform.
Thanks, Max. So on that note, I'm going to turn it back over to Katie, who's going to take questions from the audience.
Yeah, great. Thank you both so much for such an interesting discussion. Our audience members are very curious, so I want to continue to flesh out the application of this proposal in the US, starting with this. So this audience member said, your book emphasizes the importance of citizen engagement and representation. How would a parliamentary system better serve the interests of ordinary citizens compared to the current system?
Well, it would do that because we would no longer be in a winner-take-all environment. Would suddenly be in a world of coalition governance where the leaders of parties don't have to get everything if they win, and where they can negotiate with leaders of other parties, giving those parties' constituents something of value. So that example I gave before, say a Democratic-led coalition that brings in the progressives, or a Republican coalition that might bring in either the progressives or even a grand coalition between the Republicans, centrist Republicans and centrist Democrats. Compromise is no longer a dirty word. Purity becomes the dirty word in the sense that you don't want to live in a society where the winner gets everything and ideological purity is the command of the day, because the enemy of democracy is extremism, an insistence on ideological purity rather than a willingness to play well with others.
Thank you so much for reiterating that point. And next up, how do you see the relationship between the executive and legislative branches evolving under a parliamentary system, especially in terms of checks and balances?
So one of the ironies is that relaxing separation of powers in the way that I've structured this proposal, moving toward a parliamentary system, actually enhances accountability, because it is no longer the case that you are beholden to a particular individual who holds all the strings of control in a two-party system. There's genuine competition among multiple parties and multiple parties coming together to form a coalition. And so if you have somebody who is occupying the presidency, who is engaging in behaviors fundamentally contrary to the demands of that office and to the furtherance of the objectives of the coalition, that person can be replaced. And my goal in the Third Amendment is not to remove presidents. My goal in the Third Amendment is to have a set of institutions that motivate the head of government to be responsive and responsible. And so the idea is we may think separation of powers enhances executive accountability, but historically that's not true. We have never successfully removed a president under the impeachment clause. Think about that. 250 years, or not quite 240 years really, but never once. The idea that separation of powers is the means of accountability in a two-party system is simply contrary to history and experience and to what we can learn from the way other nations do democracy better.
Great. And I think that this next question is a very important one. So how would this system deal with hung parliaments where no party gets a majority and no stable coalition emerges?
So I have avoided that problem because I think about the fact the United States is the largest economy in the world, the greatest superpower in the world. We can't afford to have endless coalition negotiations, which means we have to put some limitations on the rules of the game of negotiating. And so what I do is I have it on a very fixed calendar with a backstop. And the backstop's a threat point. The threat point is that if after 5 leaders of seated parties can't do it, the plurality coalition wins. The plurality party wins. Now, of course, if the plurality didn't successfully create a governing coalition or join one, it means it's an outlier party. So that's a threat point that other parties can realize is a threat point and avoid by coming together in a majority coalition. But it makes sure that we continue to operate on a fixed schedule so that we can commit to ourselves as a nation and to other nations across the globe. You don't have to worry that we're going to be like some parliamentary systems that can never commit to a government. The United States cannot afford uncertainty of a governing schedule. So I've set this up in ways that infuse really significant features of coalition governance, but that avoid some of the intractable difficulties that have confronted some more problematic parliamentary structures.
Okay, and just to follow up on the checks and balances question. This audience member said, I like the system proposed, and does this system lessen the presidential power? So would the coalition participate to make serious world impacting decisions?
Well, certainly the president is going to be the leader of a coalition, and there are going to be negotiations, and those negotiations may affect the manner by which we engage as a country with certain foreign affairs. Those negotiations also happen in primaries, frankly, right? The difference between a parliamentary system and a presidential system is that coalitions tend to form before the general election in presidential systems. They tend to form after the general election in a parliamentary system. But I don't take away any of the powers of the president that are set out in Article 2. I don't take away any of the powers of Congress set out in Article 1. I don't take away any of the powers from the judiciary set out in Article 3. It is the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy. Now, do I think that there will be no evolution in the relationship between Congress and the president over time under my system? Of course there will be, just as there has been under the system that we have. There will be differences, right? I think those differences will be benign. I think they will be helpful, but I don't think they'll be disempowering, because I don't think that a coalition will ever benefit by preventing the head of the coalition, which they're invested in forming a government, from being able to effectively present commitments of the United States on the international stage. Quite the contrary.
Thank you so much. And another really interesting question that came in, if a state was to try this system as an experiment, which state do you think would be the best candidate?
So I have to sort of say something about the premise of that question. I believe that we cannot be a multi-party system from the bottom up. I think this has to be top down, because it is the case that those operating within our two-party system ultimately realize who the head of the party is. And the whole problem here is the president isn't just head of a branch, the president is head of a party. And you are therefore dependent on the grace of our sometimes most ungrace-like or ungrateful leaders of parties. There are some changes that can be effectively implemented bottom up. This one, however, has to be top down, but I will say this. This is a system that states could happily and successfully replicate once we have it in place at the top level. And I can't think of any states where it couldn't be done effectively. I think it would be especially helpful in particularly large states, because you would get rid of the same zero-sum politicking in states, and you would create coalition bargaining. And I think that this system of doing democracy would work just as well in states. Now, I think local government's different, but in terms of state-level government, I think that this would be a beautiful way for states to do it, but I think it has to be top down, not bottom up. And I want to be clear, nothing in my book compels states to do that. But if states elected to do that, it would be natural, because states frequently copy the federal model on a lot of in a lot of respects.
Great. And do you think that ranked choice voting has worked in the US where applied?
It generally doesn't work, because the premise of ranked choice voting is actually contrary to the problem ranked choice voting is called upon to solve. And you can look at the Alaska special election, where there were 4 candidates that went up to the final 4. 1 dropped out. You ended up with 3, Mary Peltola, Nick Bacik, Sarah Palin. And the way ranked choice voting typically works, including there, is also called instant elimination voting. So you rank the choices among the candidates. The candidate that gets the fewest votes gets knocked out. The centrist candidate in that case was Nick Bacik. It turns out that if a certain percentage of Sarah Palin voters had just stayed home, Palin would not have knocked out Bacik, and then Bacik would have defeated Peltola. This is not against Peltola, don't get me wrong. But the intuition underlying ranked choice is a standard distribution, like a bell curve of voters. So you get to vote for the extreme candidate, then the slightly less extreme candidate toward the moderate on each side of the spectrum. The problem is that our system is confounded by a bimodal distribution, which means that the centrist candidates will get fewer votes. They're the ones that get knocked out. And all ranked choice is going to do is speed up the choice between the extreme candidates that our system is already choosing between. So it's the wrong fix. I don't mean to suggest it has no place, but the idea that that's a panacea for our constitutional crisis is mistaken. And in addition, it's a system that if it actually were seriously entertained at scale, leaders of the 2 political parties would oppose it in the House and Senate, because the goal would be to replace them with more moderates. It's another example of an unemployment act disguised as constitutional reform.
Really interesting, and I appreciate your clarity on that, definitely. This audience member said, one criticism of parliamentary systems is their potential for instability and frequent changes in government. How would your proposed model address this concern, specifically regarding geopolitical issues?
That's the whole idea of using the system that I'm adopting, which is precisely designed to avoid that instability. So you're right. If you have a hyper-fragmented system, pure proportionality, as opposed to this system, which is called mixed member MMP, mixed member proportionality, okay, you end up with that sweet spot of having roughly between 4 and 8 parties. This system was designed to avoid the problem that you describe. It was actually designed for Germany after World War II, and it has been replicated variously across the globe. Germany has a particularly complicated version of it. In constructing the system for the United States, I avoid a lot of those complexities. They've actually just reformed their system because of some complexities we don't want to have time to get into. But the idea is, by avoiding these twin threats to democracy, too few parties or too many, and having that Goldilocks center, more parties than two, but not too many, we avoid that instability. And when we couple that with the calendaring rules that I have for voting, we end up with a stable system, but a stable system that is just much more responsive, much more inviting, and isn't winner take all.
Wonderful. And so for our last question today, I see it fitting to end on a question about California, since we are a California-based council. So here in California, 2010's Proposition 14 created a jungle primary with the idea it would help moderate candidates. Sorry. Do you think it has worked?
So I will say this. I don't want to answer a question where I haven't gone in and studied the details of the outcomes of the jungle primaries. I have a general familiarity with it. I will say, again, at scale, requiring states, as opposed to states doing it on their own, requiring states to open up their primary systems as opposed to having closed primaries as a means of getting more moderate people in office at the expense of people presently holding office is an unemployment act for people who are holding office. So I'm not opposed to states voluntarily opening up their primaries. I will say that as it becomes more prevalent, you're going to see more pushback by those who hold office, who are, sort of in Congress, when it could be used in a way that begins to threaten their status. So as with other reforms, the purpose and effect of which is to displace people whose support is required to bring about real reform, this is an example of something that I don't think at scale would solve our problem. I have no problem with individual states choosing different methods of primary systems. I will say, though, that as these things bubble up, the two parties, we can say, fundamentally dislike each other, except on one point. They love each other's commitment to having a two-party system. And we've seen that again and again. And there's a body of case law about that allows the entrenchment of a two-party system. So as these ideas become more prevalent and more threatening to the two-party system, we're going to see the two parties finally agreeing on something, pushing back against these proposals. My proposal, by contrast, leaves every sitting member of the House and Senate an incumbent in the district or state that elected them.
Well, thank you both so much, Max, for your amazing insights, and Emily, for your insights and your wonderful moderation as well. I want to give you both the floor in case you have any closing remarks for us.
Yeah, well, I'll just say thank you to the council and to Katie, and especially to Max for a really always stimulating conversation. Thank you, Max.
And I'll say the same. Of course, thank you, Katie, and thank you, Emily, for doing this. It really has been very interesting and hopefully fun for your audience and informative for your audience. I just want to say, look, I hope you'll read the book. I will say this: I think I'm a good tour guide. I really do. I not only tell you how these systems work, I also show you some interesting sites along the way. I think the book is written for people to not only learn from, but to enjoy. In this project, frankly, there aren't more important projects than making sure that our legacy is leaving a thriving democracy, not just for ourselves, but for the future. And that's why I wrote this book.